On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Foundation for the Carolinas, inspiring philanthropy and empowering individuals to create a better community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
That course, being retired notwithstanding, if I could go back right now and do that, I would do that. If you told me, come do this every day for the rest of your natural life, in a heartbeat. Because I want, number one, I want a generation to know about that movement. I want a generation to know about that movement simply because it's worthwhile history, absolutely. But when we look at cause and effect, well, we live in a world that is an effect, and certainly an effect would be social equality in America. How do we get here? You see, and before the beginnings of that movement, there was no move afoot to try to ensure that America become the society that the 14th Amendment suggests that we become, that is, one that operates equally for everyone.
Richard Pinder is a retired assistant professor of history at Johnson & Wales University. Richard taught courses on world history, leadership, religion, and civil rights. He has presented extensively on civil rights legislation. He had a 40-year career in education, teaching at all levels of instruction, from elementary school to middle and high school to community college and private universities. Richard taught in the Michigan and Florida public school systems before relocating to North Carolina. In this episode, we explore partisan news, finding your way as a young person, faith in an evidence-based world, and the rewards of a career as a teacher. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Richard, welcome.
Thank you. As I said before, I am honored.
Well, I'm honored to have you, Richard.
Thank you for that.
Richard, you recently retired from a 40-year career as a teacher and college professor of history and as a scholar of civil rights. What is drawing your attention today?
Politics, for sure. Politics today obviously have become probably more divided than ever. I think that some of that is driven certainly by the amount of media that we have out here. I happen not to be a huge fan, for example, of cable news. That is more commentary and opinion-driven news, and I put news in quotes. But it's a 24-hour cycle that has the capability to spread influence. It's not always accurate. I, at one point, used to be what I would probably accurately term an evening news junkie. Come home from work, and from the time I got home from work until I retired to 11:30 at night, I would sit and watch cable news, particularly MSNBC. And they were probably more in my wheelhouse in terms of political philosophy. But after a time, I got tired of that because, again, it's mainly commentary. And so when I look now at, first of all, I almost never now pay attention to that which I have a passion for. I don't watch cable news anymore. And the politics have become so toxic. The news has become so skewed toward a base of followers that I'm simply turned off by that. Now, I don't mind commentary and I don't mind opinion. We've always had that in the news. But that seems to be what we call news today. And so something that I have an absolute passion for, politics, it's rare now that I'll sit and watch it.
A common complaint from our current administration is that the news is fake news. Are you saying the same thing?
That's a great question. If I say no, it'll be because I don't want to line up with president, okay? But there might be some truth in that. Absolutely, there might be some truth in that. I would give that response. I want to think that I'm on a totally different end of the spectrum in terms of why I would say that versus the reason the president would say it.
Well, why do you think the news is the way that it is?
Well, number one, we live in a capitalist society. And I don't know, this might be the easy answer, but it also might be the correct answer. All right. It's the old thing that I remember there was a statement about the news, say, if it bleeds, it leads. Well, today I don't know that bleeding leads, but whatever seems to be the most outrageous is what leads. I don't have a problem with an organization having philosophical bent, but if ratings are simply what drives what's going to be viewed, then I think that that's a disservice to the public. Now, of course, we've got advertisers out here that they're hoping to target the largest audience or their target audience. And media outlets have to be responsible to that. And so what gets sacrificed in the meantime? Probably some truth and fairness.
Richard, there are so many things about your retirement and your interests that we can talk about. I'd like to talk about this life that you have led. You grew up in Savannah, Georgia in the 1950s and 1960s. How do you remember the Savannah of your childhood?
Well, let's answer that in layers. Number one, probably as happy-go-lucky a kid as a kid should be. I played a lot of sports, a lot of ball in the streets, on the park, organized, and that was a constant. So that part of childhood, that was a happy place. So again, that would be one layer. Another layer, of course, is the home that I grew up in. I was raised by my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother was a pretty mean lady. She was not the grandmother, I guess this idyllic person who, this ideal grandmother, I guess, that baked the cookies and pies for her grandchildren and looked forward to seeing you and, just slathered love all over you. She was not that person. Strict disciplinarian would be one way to describe her. Again, another would simply be to say she was mean. This was a person who she didn't mind using a strap. Guess that was pretty commonplace in those days, parents in terms of how they disciplined. And I don't know if I checked closely enough now, I might still see a whelp on me somewhere. I don't know. But I got a lot of whippings from her. My mother, by contrast, only whipped when necessary. Okay. But the bottom line was that they both required, I guess, if you were going to live here, you were going to do right. And I was afraid of those two women. I was afraid of them. Okay. And because I knew they could hurt me, you see. And so the foolishness of childhood that, we're all going to experience, I could almost be certain that getting too far out of line meant consequences and repercussions. Now, that would be the case probably up until I was 12 or 13 years old. Okay. That's one layer. Another layer, of course, would be that church was a very important part of life. Okay, I say all the time that had that element not been part of my life, I don't know where my life would have ended up, because the influence of my church on my philosophy as a child, in terms of how I addressed myself to quote unquote sacred spaces, okay, how I revered the old brothers and old sisters in the church in terms of their piety, in terms of honoring the fact simply that they were the adults, and they were to be regarded as such. But even more importantly, I got a lot of validation from my church, and that would be the case up through college, in fact. I got a lot of validation from my church, and validation in terms of my life ambition, and, at that point, what I wanted to study when I went to college, who I wanted to be or become as a person. One of the things that I truly, truly believe about how a boy becomes a man, I truly believe that it takes a man to truly usher a boy into his manhood. Okay, I'm not saying that it can't happen, and I'm going to seem to disagree with myself here a little bit. I'm not saying that you can't become a fantastic, responsible man without the presence of a male in your life, in those formative years. But I think it's made a lot easier. Well, I got that validation from my church. Okay. I guess we would say today I got a lot of love from my church. I was supported financially. When I went away to college, I would be given opportunities to quote unquote shine before the congregation, as either a speaker, and when I would speak, give a speech, or someone valued what I thought. Now, I didn't perceive it as valuing what I think or me as a person. I simply, when asked to do, would try to do. But when I looked back on it, I realized how those experiences were shaping me, and how it made me feel, and how they viewed me in that congregation. And so I would give a lot of the credit for how I was formed as a man to my church.
How do you think those factors in combination shaped you? You speak of your grandmother and your mom, who you were often afraid of, not having your father at home, and also growing up in the church. That combination, how did that shape you?
Well, number one, I think the church is an institution that, particularly in Black life, and I don't know that this is any different than the part that a church would play in white life or any other ethnic group, but the church was focal, all right, in those years in Black life. And so a reverence for that space, okay, a reverence for, the sacraments that we might identify as holy, WHOLLY, belonging to that space. I revered those. In the early years, my folk required that I to go to church, okay? And again, one of the things that I say even now, I don't know that in fact, I know they didn't have all of this psychology, about how this experience today is going to shape you tomorrow. They were simply living a life, and their lives centered around the institution of the church. They understood that they wanted obedience if you were going to live there in their home. So that's how they shaped how we were going to move in the space of home and church. And so we just did it. Okay. Again, I don't know. I'm sure they didn't have all of the psychology. For example, to correct child right now in the immediate with corporal punishment, where today we'll go through all of this calculus about whether we should do that, and if we do, how we should do it, and how long and how much. They didn't go through that calculus. Okay, so yeah, that's how that came together. Okay, absolutely. And of course, when I went away to school, that was you're entrenched even further in that environment. Yeah, again, that's how that all came together. Yeah, great question.
You did go away to school. You went to a private boarding school during high school. Where did you go?
Pine Forge Academy in Pine Forge, Pennsylvania. Going back to this discipline thing, while I probably will not characterize myself as a bad child, I was a growing male child, and the usefulness of a strap had probably run its course by the time I was 13 years old. And so going back to, again, my church, one of the conversations that I began to have was this business of going away to school. Okay, Pine Forge Academy was at that time the only black boarding school in America, not a reform school. Make sure I eliminate that from anyone's understanding. But when the idea was introduced, I never visited the campus. There were a couple of kids from my church who attended Pine Forge, and I don't recall ever having any conversations with them about their experience. But I don't know if at that point it meant for me the bug that we all get to want to leave home at some point. Maybe that's what was a part of what was going on as well. And so when the idea came up, jumped on it. I don't know, maybe they thought that they had reached their wits' end. Okay. And so, yes.
Do you think you've gone through life resisting authority and discipline?
No. No, and yes. Let's clear that. No and yes. Okay. I don't particularly like convention for convention's sake. Okay. You asked that question because you know that about me. Okay. All right. But I understand that there's authority and there's hierarchy. And we need to honor that. That those who choose to be outliers, they don't thrive well in this society. Up to and including, if not prison, maybe even death. So, yeah, an example of a convention might be, if I belong to a certain organization and we believe these things, these ideas, then these ideas become absolutes. And, as an example, I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist. A convention was that one's ticket to heaven was regular and faithful church attendance. And so, how do you address yourself to that? You regularly attend church in order to improve your chances, maybe even guarantee your chance of going to heaven. As I got older, that was a convention that I rejected, and I do to this day. So from that standpoint, if you're going to come to me with something that can't be proven to be, from a practical sense, something that is truth, then I'm not buying it. And I'll resist you. Yeah, I'll resist you.
Richard, you went to Oakwood College in Huntsville, Alabama.
Yes.
Why Oakwood?
Well, I wanted to be a minister. And Oakwood had a theology major. In addition, a lot of the kids I went to Pine Forge with also transitioned to Oakwood. Now, between the academy and my freshman year, I actually did not go to school. In fact, when I finished high school, I was done with school. Already. I graduated high school with something in the neighborhood of probably a 2.1 GPA. That's barely a C average, right? I was content to let that kind of symbolize who I was as a person. And when I finished high school, I went out and got what I would refer to as a nickel-dime job, and I was a custodian at a hospital. I bought myself a car. I was the first person in my family to own a car. The youngest member of the family. And I bought a car, and nothing mattered but the weekend. You make whatever, and come Monday, you've blown it all on some foolishness, and my foolishness was alcohol, girls, and marijuana. Okay, alcohol, girls, and marijuana. And at some point along the way that year, I quote unquote came to myself. And Mark, there should be something about all of our lives. You can do a whole lot of stuff you shouldn't do, but if you know better, okay, and you've been taught better, you shouldn't be satisfied or happy continuing to do your foolishness. And that's what happened with me. This is I graduated high school in 72, so the year 72 to 73, this would be that period of time when I finally came to myself. In Savannah, back home with my mother and grandmother. But now I'm not 11, 10, 12 years old. I'm an 18-year-old man-child. So the little guy who was starting down a path at 12 and 13 years old, he's matured in that path at 18 years old. These two adults now cannot handle or manage this person anymore. I remember my mother hitting me upside my head one day because what else could she do with an 18-year-old? A strap's not going to work anymore. So that's the time frame. And so, again, I saw this as the path going to nowhere. And Oakwood, I certainly knew about Oakwood, again, through my church and certainly from the Pine Forge experience, friends being there. And despite the young guy I just described to you, I wanted to be a minister. And Oakwood had that major. Off I went.
And what was that experience like for you once you arrived?
I took that 2.1 student to college. My freshman year, I had to prove to myself, I guess, that I could do college level work. And so I made the honor roll. I had a 3.0 first quarter of my freshman year. And then once I realized that I could do college level work for the next then 2.5 years, I went back to being Mr. 2.1. My junior year is when I became serious again about college, my studies, the academic side of it. I became a quote-unquote student, all right, for those last 2 years. Made and continued to develop a lot of great friendships. My best friends to this day are friendships that I made at Pine Forge and Oakwood. It was an environment that helped to foster the talents, the gifts that you could bring. If you wanted to sing, you could sing. If you wanted to preach, you could preach. If you wanted to be a social activist, you could be a social activist. If you wanted to be a community activist, you could be a community activist. And it was an environment where, being an HBCU, where you couldn't get lost. I mean, I guess we could all get lost anywhere, but if you didn't want to get lost, you couldn't. And so absolutely, two of my children attended Oakwood, and one of them would take nothing for the experience. The other one would gladly give it back.
Richard, you went to Oakwood. You studied theology. What happened after you graduated?
Well, first I'll say this. I have never made a dime from that major in my life. I minored in education, history and education. And so when I graduated, I went to Detroit to teach junior high and secondary, teaching religion and history. That became my bread and butter. Wherever I would attend church, I would work in the church, their elder or pastor staff, and we would get an opportunity to use preaching and the homiletics part of of theology, what the Greeks call the didaskos, the learning, the education part of it, of theology. But I never got paid for it. So teaching became my life's profession. I don't know how, if I had done the pastoral thing, certainly how that would have worked out. I don't know. I've been rewarded times over. I mean that, from the teaching profession.
Richard, I do want to talk about teaching, but I do have a question regarding these passions of yours of religion and history and civil rights. And I have this question that you might be able to help me with. Christianity has historically been the religion of the oppressed, telling folks to bear their suffering in the here and now so they will see Jesus in the afterlife. Mm-hmm. Do you think Christianity has held black folks back?
I think Christianity has held almost all of its adherents, its followers, back. We could probably argue, yes, black folk more so because of the socioeconomic history. But I think Christianity as a religion, I think that there's so many false narratives. There's so many narratives with Christianity that simply are not the truth that Christians believe. And they are believed because Christianity also pushes the idea of faith, accept on faith, accept by faith. To base your truth on faith is to base that truth primarily on what cannot be seen, what cannot be touched. It's out there somewhere, don't know where, but I believe that it's there and it has an impact and shapes my outlook and my life. We live in an evidence-based world. We live in the physical world. We live in the natural world. The laws of physics, natural laws, are facts that shape the way we live. You know, this hurricane that's coming through here is a part of the natural world that will shape how we live. We don't know determine how the physical world and the natural world operate. But again, there's plenty of evidence that that's the world we live in. Christianity, and to a greater extent religion, requires us to suspend the need for evidence. There's even a contingent of Christian folk who will give you slack if you don't simply accept life experience by faith. You'll get a lot of slack for that. Faith is hope, but hope isn't material. Hope isn't, it's a feel-good notion to hang on to, that maybe something about life will change. But there's so much control that Christians and Christianity gives to some entity that's outside of oneself. It holds us back. It can't but hold you back. Now, here's something that I believe. I believe in God. I believe in God. I believe that the God that I believe in has given me the ability to reason. He has given me intelligence and judgment, and he expects me to use those. When I simply decide that I'm going to rely upon God to provide food for me, a job for me, when he has given me the ability to grow my own food, to being resourceful enough to go find where food is located, that he expects me to use. That ability has given me to make that happen. Same thing with a job. I need to do whatever I need to do to put my skills out there, to be given an opportunity to get that job. He's not going to give me a job. To believe the other is what holds a lot of Christians back, I think. And I think that that's a detriment to many blacks in the Christian experience and all Christians everywhere.
And I ask the question because Christianity says, accept the world as it is because it's the next world that matters.
Right.
And to forgive our oppressors. So faith and forgiveness gives hope and solace to the oppressed, but it also has them not being militant against their conditions. So I wonder, when I think of the black church in particular and our legacy of racial oppression in this country, if things would have been much further along, if the black church didn't, in some ways, keep their congregations passive.
Well, and I think another element of that is, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. I think another element of that, though, is the black church as an institution is no different than any other institution that exists. And that is, institutions primarily exist for one reason, and that is to ensure their survival, to thrive and survive. To the extent that the black church insists, well, I'll say the church that I attended, insists on the tithe, the offering, and whatever way that you support financially the church, the organization, to whatever extent that message is there, believe it, that message is constant and ongoing. There's a huge narrative about sacrificial giving. In other words, we know you don't have it, or you might not have it, but even if you don't, give what you, if not what you have, what you can to the church. Now, one of my pet peeves has always been, so when I need something, how willing is my congregation to help me to see to my need? I don't know if my lights are off, if my kids' tuition needs to be paid, or whatever the case might be. So the black church, and let's face it, I think that its place, its calling in the black community is not the same today as it was, when I was a kid growing up. But let's face it, the narrative has worked. It has worked.
Richard, you mentioned that you did become a teacher,
mm-hmm.
and that has been your life's work. What do you like about teaching?
I enjoy student interaction. And when I say student interaction, I'm talking about that dynamic that happens between a teacher and a student. As much as I love content, and I love sharing content, God knows I do, for me, that does not provide the juice as the classroom dynamic. Now, I understand that in large part I am responsible for that dynamic, and I like that element of it, being responsible for that dynamic. But there's also this part of us that if we're smart, we allow that dynamic to be organic. And we are not always the prime mover of how the dynamic takes place. And again, we're smart to let that happen when it does happen some other way. So yeah, that part of it, the classroom dynamic, that's always been what's juiced me.
Richard, you have taught at all levels, from elementary school to middle school to high school to community college to private university. Mm-hmm. Is there a particular level that you enjoyed the most?
College. Absolutely college. Yeah. And I'm going to give a plug right here for Johnson & Wales. This comes from the heart. I taught there for 12 years. And that experience was my absolute most fulfilling experience, and it was because of Johnson & Wales' emphasis on you becoming better as a teacher. I'm not one given to much outward display. So it might not have been very evident to anyone who would look at Richard Pinder and say, is he trying to get better? Is he improving? I am telling you, I took to the Johnson & Wales professional development like a fish to water because I knew, I thought I was good when I got there. I did. I thought I was a pretty good teacher when I got there. But I realized I had to step my game up. I did. So, yeah, getting better. And I enjoyed getting better. Yeah.
And what did getting better mean?
Well, number one, becoming a scholar. Number two, exploring more and different ways for delivery.
At the core of your scholarship was a passion and interest in the civil rights movement.
Sure.
You developed a course on civil rights. What was that course?
The civil rights movement from mid-1950s to the death of Martin King in 1968 bled over a little bit into the early 1970s, and we had to move a little bit into the 1970s because there were pieces of legislation that would come about as a direct result of King's assassination that didn't happen until afterwards, right? But primarily the course sort of ends his assassination. That course, wow, being retired notwithstanding, if I could go back right now and do that, I would do that. If I could, if you told me, come do this every day for the rest of your natural life, in a heartbeat. Because I want, number one, I want a generation to know about that movement. I want a generation to know about that movement simply because it's worthwhile history, absolutely. But when we look at cause and effect, we live in a world that is an effect. And certainly an effect would be social equality in America. How do we get here, you see? And before the beginnings of that movement, there was no move afoot to try to ensure that America become this society that the 14th Amendment suggests that we become, that is, one that operates equally for everyone.
What is the lasting legacy of the civil rights movement?
I think a part of it is what I just indicated, striving toward equality. Absolutely.
50 years after the civil rights movement, does it encourage you or discourage you that we have a movement called Black Lives Matter?
I'm encouraged by it. Oh, absolutely. I'm somewhat always, movements like Black Lives Matter, I really can't get a feel for how it ebbs and flows. I know that it does. And by ebbing and flowing, I mean there are times, of course, when it's more prominently before the public than others. I guess when a kid gets shot or some kind of racial abuse or whatever occurs, that's a moment of flow. When there's not something like that going on, well, we get to the ebbs. We go to the ebbs, okay. I don't know that it needs to to exist in any other way. Maybe it doesn't, because that is in fact what resulted in its founding. That it exists, I think it has to, it needs to continue to exist. I'm not even sure who the founders of the organization might be, but whatever it was that really drove them, passionately drove them, God bless them. God bless them. Yeah.
Richard, you have a grandchild.
Yes.
A grandson. What do you want him to know?
I want him to know that the world is not going to always be this place where his innocence is going to be accepted and okay. His innocence as a child is fine for now. and absolutely for everybody, no matter whose child and whose race or whatever race or whatever. Innocence as a child, the biblical passage, when I was a child, as long as he's a child, think as a child, speak as a child, that's a part of his innocence. But he's got to evolve. That's what I want him to know. He's got to evolve.
Thank you for your time today, Richard.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this.
Richard Pinder is a retired assistant professor of history at Johnson & Wales University. He earned a B.A. in theology from Oakwood College in Huntsville, Alabama, and an M.A.T. in history from Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan. And now, a personal word. In The Wire, the landmark show about street life in Baltimore, there are two police detectives, Jimmy McNulty and Bunk Moreland. Jimmy and Bunk are partners. Jimmy is white, Bunk is black. Jimmy is the younger one, smart and driven. Bunk is more seasoned. He's learned hard lessons and a trick or two about police work. Together, they do their job, changing lives. There is this scene in season 1 of The Wire where Jimmy and Bunk are having drinks at a bar. At the end of a long day, after sitting in unmarked cars, chasing down leads, interviewing witnesses, confronting drug dealers, filling out reports, and battling the chain of command, they are getting drunk. Jimmy is worried that his boss is out to get him. Bunk has his eye on a woman in the bar. They banter about what they hate. They banter about what they love. There is this affection and bond between them. Not that they would ever say it to each other. Richard Pinder and I worked side by side in the College of Arts and Sciences at Johnson & Wales University for 10 years. His desk was 3 feet away from mine. Term after term, year after year, he taught his classes. I taught mine. We would come back to our cubicles after a long day of teaching, and the conversation would begin. We talked about our first cars, his fire engine red 1967 Ford Fairlane, my rusted blue 1976 Chevy Impala. We talked about baseball, comparing the Cincinnati Reds' Big Red Machine, Johnny Bench, Tony Perez, Joe Morgan, Davey Concepcion, Pete Rose, George Foster, Cesar Geronimo, and Ken Griffey, to the New York Yankees, Thurman Munson, Chris Chambliss, Willie Randolph, Bucky Dent, Greg Nettles, Roy White, Mickey Rivers, and Reggie Jackson. His favorite, Hank Aaron. My favorite, Catfish Hunter. We talked about looks back in the day, afros, bell-bottom jeans, and black leather jackets. We talked about movies like Shaft and Foxy Brown. I pinned pictures of Pam Grier on his cubicle wall. We talked about soul music. I put a playlist together of Earth, Wind and Fire, Al Green, and Marvin Gaye, and played it loud from our corner of the office in the middle of the workday. Mercy, mercy me. We talked about religion, Christianity, and believing in God when it didn't make any sense. We talked about civil rights, the March on Washington, about Lyndon Johnson and Martin King. We talked about race, what black folks were like, what white folks were like, Law and Order, the shooting of Michael Brown, and inviting company to dinner. And most of all, we talked politics. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. We would break down the news cycle, each Republican and Democrat twist and turn. We had the highest hopes for Democrats, and it was the Democrats that frustrated us the most. We talked about a few other things too. Student performance, the administration on campus, teacher evaluations. Here's the thing. Richard and I agreed on most things, but not everything, and sometimes it would get quiet between us. Then the next day would come, and the conversation would begin again. Richard retired 2 years ago. I said a few words at his retirement party. I told him I would miss him on campus, and I do. I'm several episodes into the first season of The Wire. The show ran from 2002 to 2008. I never saw it during its original run. All the characters are new to me. Avon Barksdale, Stringer Bell, Omar Little, Bubbles, Cedric Daniels, Kima Greggs. I can't wait to find out what happens. But I'm thinking, at the heart of the show, is the partnership between Jimmy McNulty and Bunk Moreland. I'm thinking they're going to have many more nights at the bar. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, Art and Media Director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website on lifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.